Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's training talk, where I'm going to be talking about all about the aerobic system and how to train it. So firstly, we're just going to go over the difference in fitness levels between people and why they would benefit from different styles of aerobic training. Then we're going to dive into the actual training itself, and we're just going to be talking about all the zones and the benefits behind them and why it's important to stick to certain zones when you're trying to train a specific thing with the aerobic system. All right, so this first slide is all about three different athletes, okay? So on the left-hand side here, we've got the power output. So that means how fast you're running. So the pace that someone's able to run at a certain intensity. And we've got the three athletes here. So athlete A, athlete B, and athlete C. So what I'm going to go over here is just explain the difference in fitness levels between the two and areas that they would benefit from most when it comes to training. Even though we want to hit it like training holistically, but they may benefit from hitting certain things a little more than the person next to them. So when you go through a specific phase in training, working on that, like targeting that specific thing, they're going to get a lot more out of it compared to the person next to them. So just looking at the three athletes here, this bar graph indicates pretty much their max effort. So we're going off their max heart rate or their VO2 max indicated at the top there. So the first little section there, that is pretty much max effort style training. Now we've got a line here, which is called the anaerobic threshold. Now I'm going to show you in a different slide and it'll explain that a little bit better. But the anaerobic threshold is the point at which your body switches from mainly aerobic training. Aerobic, it's delivering energy aerobically, so it's producing it with oxygen, and it starts to dial right into the anaerobic system. So you start to produce that energy more anaerobically, more than anything, and you start to really fatigue because there's a big lactate buildup. And it's a precursor of fatigue. So once you reach that top part there, you're now into max effort training, okay? And that is when you start to really fatigue. Now, this next line down is the aerobic threshold. So this is the point at which you go, like you're below this line, you are pretty much fully aerobic. Like you're never fully aerobic, but 90% or whatever. You're mainly aerobic and you're mainly using fat as a fuel, with a little bit of glucose in there as well, but it's all aerobic. So you're producing that energy using oxygen, like the majority of it. Whereas if you step it up into this moderate training zone, so that's the low training zone. If you step it up into this moderate training zone, then you start to have a little bit of a dabble into the anaerobic system. So you get a little bit of fatigue, but you're able to recycle all of that and you're able to keep up with that fatigue and just keep it going for a sustained period. But then once you get past this anaerobic threshold, that's when it starts to really move into those anaerobic systems and you start to accumulate a lot of fatigue until you hit the point where you have to stop. So you don't last very long in these ones up here. You can last for a while here and you last pretty much for ages, all day down here. Okay. Now, as you can see, the three athletes here, they're vastly different with each of their abilities. So in some cases, the person with the highest VO2 max isn't always going to be the quickest, like if we're doing a running race, isn't always going to be the quickest over a running race either. So I'll just point out the differences between the three. So you can see with athlete A, their anaerobic threshold, so when they start to really tick up, like going to max effort training, is at 87% of their max heart rate. So max heart rate is just that indicator of intensity, how hard you're working. So their aerobic threshold is down at 80%. So sitting pretty normal there. Now, if we look at athlete B, their anaerobic threshold is a little higher than what athlete A is. So they got a higher threshold than athlete A, even though their VO2 max isn't as high. So their maximal output isn't as high, but their threshold is a little bit higher, and I'll explain the difference between that in a second. But you can see their aerobic threshold is pretty much the same, so they're sitting in the same spot. And then we're looking at athlete C here, and they're pretty much they've got very similar all round, but everything's just very low. So you can see that their aerobic threshold is down at 76%, and then their anaerobic threshold of their overall maximal heart rate is actually sitting at a pretty good level. So right here, you can see, because that's at 90%, is actually higher than athlete A. They're struggling with their aerobic threshold here. All right, so now I'm just going to go over and explain like the difference, what will happen between all of these. All right, so over a very, very long distance, so we're talking, you know, all day sort of work sort of stuff, like very long distance, very low intensity, these two, athlete A and B, are going to be outlasting athlete C because their aerobic threshold is only 76%. So these two here can maintain a higher effort at a lower intensity. So they're staying in that, under that aerobic threshold, and they can maintain that at a higher output. So they're running faster at that effort, all right, compared to athlete C here. So he's going to fatigue really quickly because trying to keep up with these guys, he's going to end up going above that aerobic threshold, creating a whole heap of fatigue, and end up dying in the ass. All right. So for this athlete here, it'd be really beneficial to work in this low zone a lot and bump up that aerobic threshold. Because if he bumps up that aerobic threshold, you can see his anaerobic threshold is actually pretty good. It's sitting in between these two. So if he bumps that one up, then he's going to be sitting in a pretty good position compared to, especially compared to athlete A there. All right, so that's the low aerobic. So that's the aerobic threshold. Now moving up. So if these were to, so canceling this guy out, because you can see he's lower than the others anyway. But between athlete A and athlete B, when it comes to like a max effort, let's say beep test 2.4, something along those lines there, where it doesn't last like an extended period, you know, it's under 15 minutes sort of thing, and it's just absolute max effort. Athlete A is going to take this out every time because he's got that higher VO2 max, so his maximal output, he can sustain for a bit longer than this guy. He can put more output out at that higher effort. So he's going to take out those sort of mid-range tests or races or whatever they're doing. But if it gets a bit longer than that, so we're talking 5, 10, you know, up to half marathon sort of thing, that's very lactate threshold based. So this guy here has actually got a pretty low anaerobic threshold. So over that sort of distance, athlete B, even though he hasn't got a higher VO2 max, he's most probably going to take out that race because he can sustain a higher pace. Looking at the power output here, he can sustain a higher pace for longer and without going above that anaerobic threshold. As I was saying before, as soon as you bump up over that anaerobic threshold, that's when you still really start to accumulate a lot of fatigue. So just looking at that, you can see, yeah, over an extended period, not, you know, ages worth, like working down here, but a very high effort, extended period, athlete B is actually going to take it out. So athlete A, even though he's got that VO2 max, he'd really benefit from some anaerobic threshold training. So some threshold intervals, threshold runs, all that sort of stuff. And I'll explain a little bit more of them in the next slide. So as you can see, like if he was to bump that up, then he'd start to take out all of that mid-range type stuff as well, like the higher effort, longer type stuff. Okay, whereas athlete B, what does he need to work on? He pretty much just needs to work on his VO2 max and just keep building everything up as much as possible. And then he'll start to build it up because you can see his threshold's higher. He's got a good aerobic threshold. So we just need to get that up as high as possible with some really high intensity intervals and sorts of things like that. All right, so that's just a little bit of an explanation. Like between 3 different athletes, you can have, you know, 3 different things that they would benefit from more than the other person. So not everyone's the same, and that's why when you are undertaking training programs or any sort of training, you should be going through phases where you're dibble and dabbling into different types of aerobic training. So you shouldn't always just be in low intensity training. You shouldn't always just be in high intensity training. You should be hitting them all. And there is a way to, you know, get a good broad range over the weeks, but as well as that, it's good to focus in different phases on different ones while keeping the others in there slightly as well. But it's good to keep them all in there at some point. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a good broad picture of the difference between people, and people have benefits between different styles of training. Now we're looking at the aerobic system training model that I've done up. So this is using all the methods that I like, parameters and stuff that I use with my programming. And when, like, if you do train with me, then you'll see all of these zones in there, and hopefully understanding this will give you a bit more of a clearer picture of why you should be sticking to zones and try not to go too crazy when you don't need to. Okay, so just looking at this little graph here, I'm just going to explain it. So this left-hand bar, it's blood lactate concentration. So just think fatigue. Like, the higher that gets, the more fatigued you are going to be. So lactate isn't actually the cause of the fatigue, but it's a determiner of it. So it indicates that you are fatiguing. Okay, so higher that is, the more fatigued you are. Now across the bottom here, we're looking at intensity. So intensity is in the form of percentage of your max heart rate. So the further along here, the higher your heart rate is, up until the 100% mark there. Okay, so just looking at this line here that we've got in the graph, you can see the higher the intensity, the higher the fatigue. And you get to a certain point where that fatigue just skyrockets until there's that point where you pretty much can't go on. And that's what I was talking about in that max effort style, like the high intensity training area. Now, those two thresholds that I was talking about, that those three different athletes have, that's indicated here. Now, like I said, everyone's sort of different, but everyone has around about the same. So you don't have to get too technical with this stuff. So just as long as you're working around about the correct zones and the correct ranges, you'll at least be hitting the right training. Now, you can get lab tests and all that sort of stuff to, really get a good indicator of where you are. But, that's like top level athlete type stuff. If you're working around about the right spot, then you'll be hitting the mark. All right, so this is our aerobic threshold. So that's when we change from the majority of aerobic, our systems are working aerobically with oxygen. Then we start to have a little bit of both here, but we're able to recycle everything and have hold of the fatigue pretty much, where we're able to create fatigue but get rid of it at the same time. So we're still able to sustain for a prolonged period. And then we hit our anaerobic threshold, and that's pretty much when you shit the bed. So you will go from, you'll start to accumulate fatigue, and you're not getting rid of it as quick as you're accumulating it. So it's just going to keep building and building until you run out of steam and you fatigue and have to stop. Okay, so just looking at these, like I say, this is the low intensity zone where you the low intensity training that you'll be hitting. This middle one here is moderate intensity training, and then we've got high intensity. So in the low intensity one, as I was saying before, it's mainly fat driven. So you'll be using fat as a fuel source, predominantly as a primary fuel source, but there'll still be carbohydrates in there as well. But the main thing in there is that you're doing it all aerobically. So it's all with oxygen. So you're breaking it all down and creating energy with the oxygen. Now, another thing that happens down in this low intensity training as well is our heart is allowed to expand as big as it can and contract as much as possible. Now, when you start to get into the higher intensity stuff, because you're working so hard, your heart has to pump harder. So down here, you're still working, but you're not working at the point where your heart rate has to go crazy to try to deliver the oxygen. So down here, what it allows it to do is expand as much as possible. So it increases the elasticity. So it actually increases the size of your ventricles in your heart. So it can draw more blood in and pump more blood out in the one stroke, just because it increases its actual stroke volume. All right. Then we move into the moderate training, the moderate intensity training, and that's we start using carbs a little bit more, and we start to use a little bit of anaerobic training in there as well. But with all the byproducts, we're able to keep up with the accumulation of that and we can just keep sustaining that for a pretty long time. Now, then we move into the high intensity stuff. And as I said before, that is when all of the fatigue really starts accumulating because it's mainly carb driven. Well, it is primarily carb driven because carbs are very quick for energy, and it's anaerobically as well because you need that energy as fast as possible. So your systems haven't got enough time to create that energy using oxygen. So it does it straight away, but it creates a lot of fatigue, a lot of byproducts, and you start to fatigue after a short period. Now, another thing that happens up in this high intensity as well, and a little bit in this moderate intensity too, is you create heart strength. So instead of down here creating that elasticity with your heart expanding as much as possible, up in this top end, now your heart has to pump as hard and as quick as possible. So what that does, it doesn't increase the capacity of your heart. It increases the thickness of the muscles of the outside of your heart. So now it can pump harder and faster, so it can create more volume by pumping harder and faster. Okay, so there's two different adaptations with your heart depending on what style of training that you are doing. And like I was saying before, you need both. If you miss out on a lot of low intensity stuff, you're going to be running into a wall with your high intensity. You'll get results really quickly, but you won't be able to sustain, keep getting results over a long duration. And you'll probably just hit a wall and start to plateau. All right, so looking down here, so with the aerobic threshold, you can see typically it's around about 80% for people. Most young people that are training around about 150 beats per minute. And then we're looking at the anaerobic threshold, and that one typically around about the 90% mark. Everyone's different as well. And if you go out for some hard runs and stuff around about 20 minutes, your watch will usually calculate it for you, just as long as you're wearing a heart rate monitor, like a heart rate strap, a chest strap, rather than just on your wrist, because the wrist ones are a little bit inaccurate. So chuck a chest strap on and go out and do some threshold runs, and it'll calculate it for you and give you a bit of an indicator of where you're at. Now, moving down, these are the zones that I use when I'm prescribing training. And you can see now, I'm sure you're starting to understand why it's so important to stick with certain zones rather than being like, oh, I can run faster than this, or I can run harder than this, longer than this, and all that type of stuff. It's really important to stay with zones so that you're actually getting the adaptation that's planned with training. So down in zone one, this is, I won't usually prescribe this. This is just a sort of a zone that can be used for recovery. Like you just sit on a bike for a little bit, do some mobility. It's just really easy effort type stuff, really good for active recovery on your rest days. Zone two is like your steady state effort type stuff. So long, slow runs, building up that capacity. So the aerobic capacity. So you're on that top end of your aerobic, just below your aerobic threshold. So just on that top end of the low intensity zone. So you're getting, you're really training all of this stuff here with the fat metabolism, the efficiency of your aerobic system, your heart elasticity, all of that, even your respiratory system to get that oxygen in there. All that type of stuff is really getting trained in here and becoming more efficient. And if you start to step it up, but the thing with this zone two as well, when you're doing all of this stuff, it needs to be long duration. So we're talking, depending on your fitness level, really, but 40 to sort of 90 minutes really trains that area. But understanding if you can't run that long, you're not going to be able to do that sort of thing. That's when it comes down to sport-specific stuff. But yeah, like a really good thing is go in the gym and to jump on something for 40 to 90 minutes long even, and you'll get a lot of benefits with that low intensity training. And that is to bump up this aerobic threshold and get really efficient at this low end aerobic system, and bump up that aerobic threshold there, because if you bump that up, everything else goes up as well. So now you'll be working at like below your aerobic threshold and really not fatiguing at a higher pace. As soon as when you're running, you're able to put out more output in a low intensity zone. Okay, so you can see that with your training when you're doing some training. If you're going out and you're doing 30, 40, 60-minute runs, check out your heart rate and what pace that you're actually running at. You'll soon see after a fair few months of training, it takes months worth of training, not just a couple of weeks, months worth of training, you'll start to see that your heart rate stays lower while you can run faster. And like I said, there's no real benefit, like you're getting out of the zone if you're going up into a higher intensity and you're actually changing what the training workout. So that workout is targeting as well. So bumping it up into here, we're no longer working that hard elasticity. We're no longer just working aerobic system. It's creating a lot more fatigue. Yes, you are running harder and the workout will feel harder, but it's taken away from what we're actually aiming for. Now, when we move up into zone 3 type training, this is things like this moderate effort type stuff. You'll hear the word like a lot of pretty often is tempo. So you can do many different tempo style training, like whether it's running or some sort of aerobic training. But tempo is pretty much just a moderate effort, and you can either do it continuously, all depending on what you're actually training for. But typically 20 to sort of 40 minutes is a good time for a tempo run. So we're going for a run, and it's just going to be a moderate effort. So it's only a little bit harder than that steady effort, staying in this zone 3 here. So we're making sure we're staying under the threshold. And then other things you can do as well is things like tempo intervals. So they're like longer style intervals, but you're working at that moderate effort. But what you can do when you're doing interval style stuff is you can run at a faster pace while keeping your heart rate lower, because those rests in between, even though you'll only have like maybe a 2-minute rest, it allows your heart rate to drop down. So now you can sustain a higher pace because you've had that rest and you're still able to stay in that zone. And you can do the same sort of thing in zone 2 as well. Like there's low intensity style intervals where you're just doing low intensity intervals, staying in that zone, just moving up and down for an extended period. It's a good way to keep that sort of training nice and interesting as well when you're working with that. Okay, so that's the moderate, and that's working all of this stuff here. So yeah, stepped up. Now we're going into a little bit of anaerobic stuff. We're using carbs a little bit more. So just increasing the like how quick we're able to produce energy, and able to sustain it and keeping that fatigue at bay pretty much. Now, when we move up into zone 2, that's when we're working this anaerobic threshold here. It's a really, really important place to train because, as I pointed out before, you could have a good VO2 max, but if your threshold is low, then you're going to be fatiguing way lower than what you should be doing. So to work that, you're going to be in that zone 4, and you're working like they're going to be hard intervals. So around about 80% of your max effort style stuff. And you can do it in many different ways as well. Like it's classed as a hard effort run, but it's still not max effort. So you're still just sustaining a pace, but it's going to be hard. So when you're doing things like that, so different methods you can use is a threshold run. So a really good thing to do is just a 20-minute threshold run. So you're aiming for this zone over a 20-minute period. Really good way to build it up. Other things you can do is threshold intervals. Same sort of thing we're doing with the tempo, but with the threshold intervals, we have to have it a bit shorter because you're going to fatigue a lot quicker. So talking like 5 minutes type runs and a 3-minute sort of rest in between to allow yourself to recover. But there's many, many different ways to do it. The main thing is we're working in that zone 4 and allowing yourself enough recovery to actually have some decent output during those runs or whatever you're doing. Okay, and main thing is, getting used to that area, the feeling of it. The pain threshold is another thing as well. Like your pain threshold could be down here thinking, oh shit, I'm so fatigued. But this gets you used to that pain of being in the threshold zone. It bumps that threshold up. So now you're able to run, like have more output for longer before you start to fatigue, because you get really good at reuptaking lactate and you fatigue later. So you can you can sustain a higher effort for longer and win those races or smash those tests you're going for. And then we move up into the high intensity training here into like zone 5. So this is like VO2 max style stuff. And what you need to be doing with this is, yeah, having decent amount of rests in between so that you can have actually max output, and you want to be aiming for maximum heart rate as well. Because if you're not reaching that, well, not maximum heart rate, but close to, like above threshold at least, you want to be getting up there so that we're getting all of these adaptations out of it. Because if you're not pushing up to those levels, then you're just not going to be stressing the system the way it needs to. You're either doing too short, you're not going hard enough, having too much rest, all that style stuff, all that type of stuff will hurt your results from up in there. And you can see, like, there's heaps of stuff that, like, not only when you're training in those lower zones to make sure you're not going up into threshold and things like that, but it's the flip side as well. Like if you're working in the higher zones, like in the threshold or max effort type stuff, you don't want to be training just down here, because the training is not going to be enough, because you have to have obviously shorter training because that fatigue is skyrocketing here. So if you're just doing the shorter training, but you're only hitting the intensity for down here, you're not going to be getting the benefits that's planned for you for that training session. Okay, and the last thing is to remember that your fitness is actually sport specific. So it plays a big role with what you're actually doing. So if you're trying to improve running, you need to do running. So you need to train this stuff while you're running. It's good to cross train, like especially in like steady effort type stuff. Yeah, it's really good to cross train and get some load off the body while you're still stressing the aerobic system for a long duration, because especially if you can't run for very long right now, like this is a good cross training zone. But you need to remember that, yeah, it is very sport specific. So if you want to improve that running, you need to actually do some running. And initially at the start, you probably, like a lot of these zones will be very hard to train with and stuff, because you just haven't got the tolerance for running, and you'll fatigue, like your muscles will fatigue before your systems, or your heart rate will skyrocket because you've got no capacity. So you just need to work with it and just try to stay with like the prescribed stuff as much as possible, but just be aware, like if you're just starting out with stuff with this sort of thing, yeah, your body's just not used to running. Your aerobic system's probably terrible, so things will be thrown out a little bit. And in my programs and stuff, I do explain different ways of gauging your intensity as well when you're in these sort of zones outside of heart rate, because sometimes that can skyrocket when you're only just starting out, or your legs will probably fatigue because you're just not used to running, and that's a big thing as well, is get used to that sport, condition yourself, build up your tolerance to that actual sport, and then sort of worry about all of this stuff. All right, so that was a pretty in-depth explanation of training the aerobic system and the differences between different athletes, like I was talking about with the 3 different thresholds for different people, and the importance of hitting specific zones when you're trying to elicit a specific adaptation. Like you're trying to actually train something, and like I said, you go through phases and train all areas so that your whole system is built from the ground up, because it all works on each other. You can't just get really good at max effort stuff. You can't just work your threshold and build that up as much as possible. It all works together. So make sure you train smart and hit all the zones. And if you've got any questions whatsoever, then just make sure you hit me up. All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your day.